Pregnant women prioritizing their own health isn't an act of selfishness. They're simply trying to protect the baby growing inside of them. So it doesn't matter what others whisper behind their backs. Harassment and negative comments don't matter at all, because it's all about protecting that precious baby. Every day, both my baby and I face life with that conviction. A mother-in-law who endangers 2 innocent lives, I will never forgive her. I'm currently 9 months pregnant. My belly sticks out so much that it's hard to even see my feet. This is my first pregnancy, and next month I'll be giving birth. My emotions, probably due to hormone fluctuations, are like a roller coaster. But my husband has been my rock throughout, supporting me wholeheartedly. On his days off, he'd take over all household chores just to let me rest.
Potassium is good for swelling. That's why I made a cucumber and chicken salad for you.
He does so much for me and our baby. I'm incredibly grateful for him. However, there was one person who tried to get in our way.
She's getting too spoiled, isn't she?
The one casting a sharp gaze, specifically at me, was our live-in mother-in-law. Living with her was not our choice, but a result of her cunning plan. Just a few years ago, mother-in-law lived with father-in-law in a single-family home. After father-in-law passed away, she felt the house was too big and decided to move to public housing. Getting a place in public housing requires waiting for your turn, and it's highly competitive. But surprisingly, mother-in-law's turn came around quickly, and she joyfully shared the news with my husband. To help her pack, my husband and I spent every weekend at her house. But mother-in-law barely lifted a finger, just giving orders. I found myself not just making her lunch, but also preparing her dinner every day.
Your stew is quite overcooked. You should study cooking more.
Ignoring my efforts, mother-in-law constantly criticizes me. It's frustrating, especially when it feels like we're constantly in a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law conflict, even though we haven't been married long. My husband often tries to mediate, but every time he does, mother-in-law gets sulky.
So I'm the bad guy now, huh?
She'd pout and turn away like a child. Feeling bad for my husband stuck in the middle, I would apologize to mother-in-law, just to smooth things over. Amid all this, on moving day, a shock awaited us. A ton of mother-in-law's belongings arrived at our house.
Wait, why are they here?
As we looked on in confusion, mother-in-law showed up later in a taxi. She began instructing the movers efficiently. My husband asked,
"What's going on?"
"Isn't it obvious? I've moved in," she responded. Turns out mother-in-law never actually applied for public housing. From the start, she had planned to live with us and just had us help her pack as a ruse. Room by room, her stuff began filling spaces we had planned for our future children. She seemed irritated by our displeasure and made snide comments loud enough for the movers to hear.
"I get it. I'm an inconvenience. But do you think I can live alone at this age? The thought of something happening terrifies me."
She played up her vulnerability, her eyes glistening with staged tears. The performance was almost admirable. The movers looked our way, equally bewildered.
"I know it's your love nest. Having an old woman like me around is a nuisance, isn't it?"
Her tone was almost sarcastic.
"It's not like that."
It seems my husband has a soft spot for his mother's tears.
"Well then, here I am. Let's get along," she smirked.
Thus began our imposed cohabitation. Despite available units in the nearest public housing, my husband searched for apartments for her, but mother-in-law was unyielding.
"I want a place built within the last 5 years. I live on a pension. I can't afford rent, but if you're willing to cover it, I might consider."
She continued being unreasonable, and her stay extended. As time went on, mother-in-law increasingly intruded into our personal lives, and a year passed. Being the daughter-in-law, I felt unable to voice my concerns. Eventually, even my husband began to see her constant presence as the new normal. With mother-in-law always watching, I found no place in the house where I could truly relax. Soon after, I discovered I was pregnant. Both my husband and mother-in-law were overjoyed. The same mother-in-law who had treated me poorly seemed eager to help me for the sake of her future grandchild. But when she found out the baby was a girl, her attitude shifted.
"Why isn't it a boy? You really are a disappointment."
She reverted to her mean-spirited self. Even when I felt dizzy from anemia or had to lay down because of contractions, mother-in-law would expect me to do household chores without hesitation. My husband was the only one who would stand up for me against mother-in-law. But lately, he's been swamped with work and often returns home after 10 p.m. During times when I felt physically exhausted, I wanted to avoid worrying about household issues. I decided to steadfastly bear the current situation. I resolved to endure it until the birth of our child. But there's a limit to how much one can tolerate. It might be best to take some action. After some thought, I learned one day that an old friend of mother-in-law's was coming to visit.
"She's in town for a relative's wedding, so I expect you to host her properly," mother-in-law announced.
It was the next day. While mother-in-law's abrupt plans weren't new to me, I wasn't fazed. We'd order pizza for the day, and my husband diligently cleaned the living area. All was set for the visit, but then came an unexpected downpour. Rain lashed the windows relentlessly. While observing the storm outside, mother-in-law had an outrageous request.
"Given this rain, my friend might be stranded at the airport. Could you pick her up?"
"What?" Regret instantly followed my startled reply. Mother-in-law's displeased expression said it all.
"You can still drive even if you're pregnant, right? Go now."
"I can't in this weather," I replied. Honestly, my belly at 9 months pregnant felt like it was about to burst. Driving was uncomfortable and risky, especially in this weather. The mere thought of an accident due to these conditions was terrifying. I told mother-in-law straightforwardly about my concerns, my desire to prioritize the baby, and my need for rest. But mother-in-law remained unmoved.
"You're just being lazy. When I was pregnant, I did everything my mother-in-law asked," she argued.
"But what if I get into an accident in this heavy rain?" I protested.
"You're being careless. Just go get her now."
"Mother-in-law, I really can't. I'm sorry."
"You're back-talking your mother-in-law. I'm so unlucky to have a daughter-in-law like you."
Furious, mother-in-law's face turned red. For some reason, she grabbed my arm, opened the front door, and forcibly pushed me out into the pouring rain. Stunned by the heavy rain hitting my skin, mother-in-law tossed the car keys at my feet.
"Go already. My friend is still stranded at the airport because of you."
I urgently pleaded for our unborn baby's sake. "She can take a taxi or bus. There are other options."
"Just go."
As mother-in-law tried to shut the door, I desperately tried to prevent her. We struggled at the entrance. Drenched from the rain, which isn't good for a pregnant woman, mother-in-law stubbornly refused to let me back in. Then someone behind me reached for the door.
"What's going on? Mom, let her in now."
My husband had come home early. Apparently, due to the bad weather, there was no overtime, so he left work on time. He looked bewildered by the situation. Finally inside, he quickly dried me off with a towel. Seeing this, mother-in-law's mood worsened.
"Why do you always take her side? I'm your mother. This is so cruel."
"How can you be so heartless, making a pregnant woman stand out in this heavy rain? What happened?" Mother-in-law, who was earlier crying, suddenly shot back. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just asked you to pick up my friend by car." With exaggerated tears, the mother-in-law started crying, and my husband let out a heavy sigh. He probably realized there was no reasoning with her. My husband then asked me what had transpired. I recounted everything mother-in-law did and said to me. However, the previously tearful mother-in-law instantly rebutted with an angry look. "She's lying. She's trying to paint me as the bad guy and drive me out." She screamed hysterically, cutting me off before I could speak further. My husband tried his best to calm the frenzied mother-in-law, but the situation wasn't improving. In fact, it was deteriorating. "You've been brainwashed by her. You used to be such a kind, mother-loving boy." As mother-in-law began crying again, to our surprise, the doorbell rang. When we opened it, mother-in-law's friend was there. Apparently, she had taken a taxi from the airport and safely arrived. Sensing the palpable tension in the room, she inquired, "Did something happen?" Without missing a beat, mother-in-law started bad-mouthing me. "I'm sorry, I made you take a taxi. I wanted her to pick you up, but she refused because she's pregnant. Today's young daughter-in-laws are just too spoiled, aren't they?" Mother-in-law sought agreement from her friend, but her reaction was unexpected. "You tried to send a pregnant woman out in the storm? That's unbelievably cruel." Mother-in-law's forced smile faltered. Her friend didn't stop there, growing even more critical. "You've always been arrogant towards those weaker than you, and fawning over those above you. You haven't changed a bit. Actually, you've gotten worse." Mother-in-law started to panic as unexpected revelations from her past spilled out. "Also, I bet you only invited me here to show off your happy living situation with your son and daughter-in-law, right? It's so transparent." I didn't. I had my doubts about you living harmoniously with the daughter-in-law, but I didn't think you'd be this horrible to her." The friend's straightforward comments left mother-in-law unable to retort. I was genuinely surprised seeing her rendered speechless by both her son and her own friend. With the growing icy stares from everyone, mother-in-law was visibly flustered. Perhaps, in an attempt to deflect, she pointed at me and exclaimed, "If she had spoken to me more gently, I wouldn't have forced her to go out. But she's always defiant. No wonder I get angry." The truth is, I had only stood up to her this one time. Her incessant denial of wrongdoing only fueled my anger. The tipping point was when she jeopardized the safety of my unborn child. I decided to play my trump card. "I've recorded all the derogatory remarks and verbal abuse you've directed at me." I confidently displayed my mobile phone. Ever since we began living with mother-in-law, I had been recording her harassment as evidence. Even if mother-in-law and I didn't get along, she was still the only mother my husband had. I really didn't want to expose such an important person in my husband's life. But after everything she put me through, I couldn't remain silent. To start, I played our recent rain-soaked altercation at high volume. The color drained from my mother-in-law's face. Her friend, seemingly expecting such behavior, sighed in exasperation. My husband's face darkened quickly. "Mom, how could you do this to my wife?" His anger was palpable, his voice deeply stern. With the evidence laid bare, mother-in-law could only slump to the floor without any excuses. Her friend quickly got into the waiting taxi outside. I rushed to thank her. "Thank you so much." "Don't mention it. This has cleared up some long-standing grievances of mine. She's always been this way, but I'm relieved to see your husband turned out all right. Have a healthy baby, okay?" Back of the doorway stood a slumped mother-in-law and a towering, displeased husband.
Would you prefer a care facility or an apartment to live alone?
It seemed my husband had decided to end our living arrangement with mother-in-law, presenting her with two choices.
I'm truly sorry. I'll make up for it for the rest of my life. Please don't abandon me.
Despite mother-in-law's pleas, my husband's stance was unyielding. He told her to decide by the next day and then withdrew to our room. I didn't speak to mother-in-law and quickly began preparing dinner. Even when it was time for dinner, mother-in-law remained motionless in her spot. The friend who had come to our aid had attended our wedding. While at our table, she whispered, offering her support for any future troubles with mother-in-law. I remembered this gesture and had called her, seeking a witness to the torment. That's why she had visited, using a relative's wedding as an excuse. Mother-in-law initially resisted both the idea of living alone and moving into a care facility, but my husband made the final decision to place her in care. Thankfully, she had sufficient funds from father-in-law's inheritance and her savings. We became estranged from her. Every month, I received lengthy apology letters from mother-in-law, but they barely addressed the apology, mostly filled with complaints about her care facility. Feeling constantly watched, feeling she wasn't that old to need such care, I had no intention to act on her grumblings. My husband began to refuse her letters, and we lost contact entirely. On my due date, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Now, without mother-in-law around, we're tirelessly raising our child. This is what marital bliss looks like. Every day, I exchange smiles with my husband. We hope to live peacefully, just the three of us,